I think it will be another minute.
Okay. Okay. So it starts exactly at 6 o'clock.
So what were the reviews in the papers today in Europe?
I think it will be
The debate.
Something between
another minute.
Okay. Deep depression and a deep sadness. So let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all our listeners and viewers to our Zoom session on press freedom in the United States, press freedom and the United States. Just a few introductory words. The United States always used to be a beacon of hope, beacon of democracy for so many decades. But today we face quite a grim reality of structural, economical, and social problems, more divided states than United States, it seems, with so many shattered dreams, and also with so many shattered political and social norms. Trump's presidency and the horrible pandemic magnify all these problems like under a huge microscope, to put it as a picture. And also internationally, the United States has retreated from its role as a champion of press freedom, which in turn has strengthened authoritarian tendencies in other nations. And this vacuum of leadership apparently has compromised the safety of journalists and led to the shrinking of space in which independent media around the world can operate. So today we want and we need to talk about press freedom in the United States. How is the situation? Is the freedom of the press under pressure? And if so, why? What are the challenges journalists, correspondents face covering the White House and a president who uses Twitter as his main communication channel, not journalists as information gatekeepers anymore? And how does that change the conversation? And 5 weeks before a very crucial election, we have two distinguished and very experienced journalists and one distinguished and very experienced media critic and professor of journalism to join us for a conversation about the state of the union in respect to press freedom. So we welcome Dana Priest, one of the journalists in Washington at the Washington Post, so well known to all of us for her reporting on Bush's war on terror, for her investigative reporting on black sides and the very, very dark side of that administration. You are a 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner, Dana, and today you teach future and still optimistic journalists at the University of Maryland. We welcome Jay Rosen in New York, professor of journalism at New York University, who says about himself that he's a lone writer, editor of Press.org, and one of the most renowned press critics in the United States. You've been, Jay, an advocate of citizen journalism for many years, and you are a fierce critic of the Trump administration. You say the presidency of Donald Trump is an active threat to democracy.
Yes.
Of course, we welcome Elmar Thewissen, former deputy editor-in-chief of ZDF German television, addicted to foreign policy and security policy. And since last year, you are the head of the Washington bureau of ZDF. I think it's your second term in the United States. You are right now on a road trip across the country. You already made 4,000 miles or something, you just told me, 1 month, 2 campers, and we find you in Cleveland, Ohio, still kind of recovering from the first presidential debate. I'm Katja Gloger, journalist myself, foreign correspondent, used to be based in Moscow and Washington as well. And I'm here today in my function as executive member of the board of the German section of Reporters Without Borders. 2-3 seconds for housekeeping. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a good hour for our conversation. We very much welcome comments and questions for listeners and viewers. Our colleagues, Christine Besse and Juliane Matta at our Berlin office will give us an overview in between. So we try to answer your questions and comments in between and at the end of our session as well. So welcome everybody to the conversation. And for a starter, for our viewers, we have a very short video about the State of the Union in respect to press freedom. Let's get started.
This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. Where the state safely media.
Oh.
Whoa!
I'm press. I am press.
I don't care, get down.
Okay, I'm down. I'm down.
We got protesters now moving closer in. The police continue to fire.
Ali, it sounds like they're chanting, do it, like they're daring the state troopers to fire on them again. Am I hearing that right?
All right, guys, I got hit. Yeah, I got hit. Hold on.
I remember this guy, Welchie, he got hit on the knee with a canister of tear gas, and he went down. He didn't, he was down. My knee. Nobody cared. These guys didn't care. They moved him aside. And they just walked right through. It was like, it was the most beautiful thing. I think it's very clear that there are people in your profession that write fake news. You do. She does.
200 dead, 14,000 who are sick, millions, as you witnessed, who are scared right now. What do you say to Americans who are watching you right now who are scared?
I say that you're a terrible reporter. That's what I say.
I have two questions, Mr. President.
Next, please.
But you called on me.
I did, and you didn't respond, and now I'm calling on
Sorry, I just
the
wanted
young lady in the back, please.
I just wanted to let my colleague finish,
Okay.
but can I ask you a
Ladies and
question,
gentlemen,
please?
thank you very much. Appreciate
But
it.
you called
Thank you
on-
very much.
So this was a short video introduction. And let's get right to it. Dana, my first question to you. You've been watching the debate yesterday. What's your main takeaway of it?
I hate to sound very common, but it's a debate like no other that we've seen. I think because we're talking about press freedom, I'd like to stick to that topic for a minute and to say that what you saw last night was Donald Trump once again using fake news to label the New York Times reporting on his taxes. And he's been so clever and so effective. And this is very new for the United States in this modern era to now to have many, many people accept the idea that the media produces fake news, that the mainstream media in particular produces fake news. And this is a widespread belief now that is held by Trump supporters. So one of the points I want to make in this debate, or in, sorry, not a debate, in this discussion is that the fake news moniker is really pushed by social media. And social media has become, and I would say the main platforms, Facebook and Twitter in particular, has become one of the most destructive instruments to press freedom that we've known. And it's not just because they are irresponsible in taking down disinformation and clearly fake news, but it's that their business models are built around fake news and emotional news. And that is why I believe, having looked at this quite carefully, that they aren't going to do what they really should do and censor media that's not really media. And go back to what they say their original mission was, which is having you connect with your family and friends. So I do think that social media is in the in the cauldron, in the boiling pot of threats to press freedom in the United States, and especially during this election.
All right, so we come to social media maybe in a minute or two. Let's move over to Elmar to ask him about his impression about this debate and about his impression. What does it show about the state of, so say, media, or about the perception of media in this country?
Well, let me start with saying that this is commentary, what I'm about to say. I think the entire debate was an assault on the democratic process of the United States of America, which
yes,
and an attack, an assault. So, and part of the democratic process is, of course, a free press. So what Dana just said is exactly right. To label us as fake news, to sow doubts in facts, what the president just did last night again, and also to try to create complacency and depression about what's happening in the world and about what's happening in the United States, creates exactly an environment that makes it possible to erode the institutions of a democracy even more. And one of them, and I think a very important one of them, is, of course, freedom of the press. And when we travel the country and we meet people which have I said that in this promotional video, which have this nice letters on their rope, tree, journalist, easy to assemble, then that says something about the state of the attitude towards journalism. And unfortunately, this is continuing and getting worse. While at the same time, and that's a little hope, a glimmer of hope, I want to inject as well, having traveled more than 4,000 miles now, what we experience is that people tell us they wish for a different kind of news. They wish for good news. They want to learn something about their community, about the country. But unfortunately, this has been eroding for quite some time. And Dana, I know you are very active in trying to revitalize community journalism, as Jay is doing, with 1,800 newspapers shutting down over the past 10 years in the United States, local newspapers. I think we are really on the verge of a very, very critical situation in the United States.
Let's move to Jay. Jay, do you think that the freedom of the press is not only under pressure, but even being threatened in the United States, in the democracy, in one of the first democracies ever?
I think it is under pressure and under a new kind of threat, or maybe not new, but different than what we might have expected in earlier eras. Instead of journalists being thrown in jail or physically assaulted, there's been some of that as well. Instead of the law, the power of the state coming down on the press, I think we're in the middle of something that we might call press nullification. We have this press nullification, meaning instead of trying to directly control journalists and keep them from reporting the truth, you make their work irrelevant by, for example, teaching your supporters that this is nothing but fake news, by flooding the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon, Trump's advisor, has described his method of propaganda. It's in the Soviet context, or excuse me, ex-Soviet or Russian context, it's called the fire hose of falsehood, where you put out so many things that are misinformation or disinformation or distraction mixed in with some things that are actually true, that you make it impossible for people to tell what is true and what is false. And the idea is not so much to persuade them or to control their minds, but to get them to give up. So another way to think about press nullification, to nullify the press, is that it persuades people there's no point in paying attention. Now, with Trump supporters themselves, something even more radical is going on. in addition to being taught to treat journalists as enemies of the people, in addition to using the press corps as a hate object for his supporters, he's in effect kind of isolated about a third of the electorate in an information loop of its own, where Trump or Trump-friendly agents are the only source of information about Trump. And for between maybe at least 20, maybe 30% of the electorate, that is now the daily reality. They are in effect being broken off from the rest of the public and isolated in an information world of their own, where Trump is the source of information about Trump, which is an authoritarian news system up and running in the country that was once, as you said earlier, Katja, the beacon of free press around the world. So the beacon is broken. And so that's what I mean by press nullification. It's not so much that you're preventing journalists from saying what's going on as making it impossible for them to have an effect on the public.
Can I jump in just for a minute?
Sure.
And also add a little bit of a different angle to it, which is every president comes to hate the press, more or less. I remember during George W. Bush, when after 9/11 happened and that administration undertook an extreme level of secrecy in national security, and many of us tried to write through it, tried to bust through it. You know, both he and the Vice President Cheney and all of their spokesmen and their surrogates on the media did their best to portray the media as unpatriotic. Obama, to some extent, actually to a large extent, did this too when he was pilloried for whatever reason by the press. And of course, his Justice Department took up more leak investigations than any previous administration. So in this country, and I do think that's different than in Europe, the press is largely adversarial to the president and always criticizes. So, and one other thing to add to what both Jay and Elmer were saying is this, herding the Trump readers into their own ecosystem of news has also, I think, been aided by the mainstream media. Because I think what we've done in response to selling products, selling news as a product, is we have pushed up opinionated columns into the news space or into the space that used to be the news. So if I'm reading my beloved Washington Post, either on my computer or on my phone, right after I get to the main headlines, I am forced to look at headlines from 6 to 8 opinion columnists, all of whom have headlines that would never have been allowed back in the day, like before the Trump administration. And they're all yelling at me about Donald Trump. So if I wanted to have an open mind as someone who was, sort of on Trump's side, I would be very offended by this. And I do think that in all mainstream media, some of this has seeped into the news sections and to the news columns as well. And I talk about this a lot with my colleagues. We all see it going on. It is part of the equation that allows for the bifurcation, if you will, of the news ecospheres that are not overlapping anymore. So we have played our part.
It sounds like you do not agree totally with this policy of the Washington Post
No, and it's not just Post, it's the Times and the others, and they really are doing it because they are competing again with social media, trying to get clicks, trying to sell advertisements against their news. So it's it's a market-driven decision.
But Jay talked about an authoritarian change coming along. Emma, would you agree? I mean, you're in your second term as a foreign correspondent covering the country, so you can compare to the situation 10 years ago or 15 years ago when you were based in Washington for the first time. Authoritarian tendencies, that's quite a strong word.
I think when I was here in the 90s, of course, we had polarization as well. And I remember being at a conference of the Christian Coalition where you could buy little puppets, you know, those voodoo puppets of Bill and Hillary Clinton, and you could stick the needles in there. And all the books that were published back then about all the murders they committed in Arkansas and other places, David Foster and so on. So the polarization was there with the Republican Revolution back there. And Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution. And let me name some other person, William Kristol. I mean, Kristol is the one who set up this very conservative right-wing media in order to have a counterpart to, in his view back then, a very liberal left-wing media. And now he is really afraid of the kid he created himself. That's why he is part of this movement within the Republican Party to stop Donald Trump. He has become a never Trumper. That's interesting to see. And now, all those years after I was here before, the polarization is much worse. And I totally agree with Dana, the media, and I say specifically also German media, because we have the same or similar problems in Germany as well. We contributed to that. If we label everything as breaking news from early morning until midnight, but it is not breaking news. If we have 7 pundits sitting there, then the 4 pages Mueller preview report thing comes out, and they're reading that from their tiny little screens and try to find the decisive sentence. And there's a competition going on between those pundits and journalists who has the right line to show what it means. And also that they always look on their iPhones or whatever telephones they have, and they get info from their sources through short messages. And instead of checking them out, trying to get the other side of the story, they read them straight into the camera, live on television. So we all contribute to that, and that really, and sorry for answering so long, but I think that leads into an environment that makes it possible to have an authoritarian regime here in the United States, which I never thought would be possible.
Still, Donald Trump is the president. He might be president for another 4 years. So we kind of have to treat him as a figure in the news and a figure of news. But how can we do it in a way that does not feed into this tendency? Dana and Jay, what's your take on this? I mean, should we not transmit briefings, press conferences, comments, tweets, whatever?
Well, I think this has been in one of the running stories of the Trump years for the American press, is so many of its routine practices rested on assumptions about how political figures and especially presidents would behave. And those assumptions proved relatively accurate for candidates and presidents of both parties for a very long time. So they seemed more solid than they were. So a lot of press practice rested on norms that were not any real part of the system legally. There was no power under them other than the belief that there would be a penalty if presidents violated those norms. So, for example, Glenn Kessler, who is the fact checker for the Washington Post, has said that candidates and presidents, Republican and Democrat, used to react to fact checks. They would change their behavior somehow. They would stop making that claim. They wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, you're right, I lied," but they would change it so that they took it out of this stump speech, or they altered it so that it met the requirements of factuality, because they felt there would be a penalty if they were portrayed as violating factuality. Well, Trump not only doesn't care about that penalty, he doesn't perceive it as important, but he doubles and triples down on false statements. And then he goes one step beyond that, where not only does he keep saying a false thing, but he uses the reaction of the press in calling him out for false statements to generate traction with his base and create this kind of atmosphere of war between himself and the press. And that is actually part of his political style. So in all of these ways, and press conferences would be an example, the briefings would be an example, what the normal behavior and accepted behavior of the press is loses its logic because they're dealing with somebody who obeys a completely different set of rules. And so another example of that would be the maxim that came to be normal practice, that what the president says is news. When Donald Trump is producing 20 stories of outrage a day, to say what the president says is news is kind of like abandoning your assignment desk to the president, right? So but it's very difficult for our journalists to revise these very deeply held assumptions and revise their practices under pressure. The press is not good at that. It's not good at rethinking its system on the fly, which is what has to happen since Trump became president. So in many different ways, the story of Trump and the press in the US is of an institution whose practices are giving way under pressure because the president doesn't conform to any of the assumptions they have about political leaders.
Before we
to add to that, I think that part of
Sorry, Dana,
part of the
move to situation in the country, because lots of is happening not only in Washington D.C. Let us hear your thoughts, Dana. So how to deal with this kind of politics, with this kind of being, you know, the news 24 hours as a person?
So I think a complicating factor is that Donald Trump gets us all to look at the news. I mean, if you just look at your own news consumption, how many times do you just check the pages to, you know, see what the latest outrage is? And that's good for business. And so the media, the mainstream media, is wrapped into that as well. But I do think if you look at last night's debate, you have you have a model for the closest that the news industry has gotten to figuring out how to deal with this, which is simultaneous or near simultaneous fact checkers. So in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, you had not only in the Post, you had Glenn Kessler, but you also had a series of journalists who were doing a live streaming chat, and each one of them was fact checking different facts along the way, so that if you had that up, you had the benefit of knowing on both sides, on the Biden side and the Trump side, almost simultaneously. It was pretty remarkable what they were saying was an exaggeration or an out and out lie. Now, to Jay's point, whether that matters or not, you know, is a different story. But I also think because he's such an entertainer and he's so good at attracting media and media attention, that, you know, during every administration, a president has a full day, and many times those days are public events. But what they say is not, let's just say it's kind of boring. You know, they've said it before, they don't say it very charismatically, you know, it's kind of it's routine, and we don't report on it. And I would claim that because of that, you know, we missed a lot of good stories during other administrations on serious issues like healthcare or domestic violence, or things that, you know, the media big brain just decided oh, we know all about that, people don't care, and it's not going to attract readers. So we've fallen into this trap of the more outrageous he can be, and he's really good at it. You watched that last night with the invalidating the election before it happened, and all the hyperbole over the trash cans full of ballots and everything. I mean, you just kind of, I was leaning into the screens thinking, what is he going to come up with next? And that's a human reaction to outrage. So we're going to have to really think hard about how to get out of that, that trap. And I do think that what happened last night in the debates, and I didn't watch Fox News or the Daily Caller, for instance, when, you know, one of the conservative media sites, to see if they were also doing simultaneous fact checking. Maybe one of you know, but I think that's something we can do.
Emma just elaborated, you know, on the responsibility also of journalists and media, kind of adding to this, to all these tendencies. On the other hand, and this is a question for Elmar as a starter, is there any room left today for so-called classical reporting, you know, based on the old, sort of say, traditional principles of neutrality, of objectivity and distance? There is a whole new generation of journalists on the ground covering the events, you know, from Ferguson to Minneapolis, who say these old principles won't help us anymore. We need, in these troubling times, we need a clear moral stand, a clear moral call, what you would call in German Haltungsjournalismus, maybe. So Emma, your thoughts on this, and then maybe Jay.
Yeah, well, I think what we need is revitalizing and reinforcement of a code of ethics for journalists. I'm not meaning that in a way that we have it in Germany. We actually have a written code of ethics for journalism in Germany. That doesn't have to be that case, but I think every media outlet has to really revitalize and reinforce. That's number one. Number two is transparency. We need to better show how we work, why we work this way, and also when we make mistakes, we have to be very transparent about them and really owning up to the mistakes and making sure that they don't happen again. So that is a process as well. So that is the second point with the total transparency. And the third point, and I think that's what you refer to, Katja, is the original role of the journalist is going out, talking to people, telling their stories. And in my view, too many of us have become, and I include myself, maybe too much of analysts and commentators. We have to really go out to the people. That's what we have been trying to do with this 4,000 miles journey called American Voices, because we put big posters on the RVs saying basically, we are here to listen to you. We want to know what are the issues that are important to you. And then confront the powerful in this country and in Germany as well with the issues, with the facts, what we have seen on the ground, and ask the tough questions about that. And if we do all that, I think then we will distinguish our signal that is out there in all that noise. We will distinguish that signal from all the other signals, which are mostly just noise. As Alexis Ohanian once put it, one of the founders of Reddit, he said, in times where everyone can distribute information, there is so much noise. And that's the moment when journalists are really important to go out to tell the stories in an authoritative, I forgot the word, sorry, in a way that makes clear what the core of the issues is for the people in the country. So this is, in a nutshell, I would say, what could be done, and we need the self-reflection for that, and I don't see that too much in the media nowadays.
Jay, your thoughts, because the situation on the ground for many of our colleagues, also in the United States, is apparently very different. So they go out and want to cover reality, the truth, in cities like Ferguson 6 years ago, where a young man was shot by the police. In Minneapolis, George Floyd was murdered, actually. So their take would be, the principles of neutrality and distance, they do not work in this environment anymore. You really need to make a clear moral call and start telling the truth from the ground and not, raising the flag, theoretical flag of objectivity.
Well, this is I hate to say this, but it's my duty as a professor it's a complicated subject. Objectivity is a complicated subject because it means many different things, and some of them are really important, and some of them we could do without, and some of them are actually harmful. I think that the press is in the middle of a shift in how trust can be generated. And the old system of we're objective, we're professionals, we know how this is done, listen to us because we are the people who don't have a stake, don't have any assumptions, don't have a philosophy, don't have an ideology. We're just telling you the way it is, so you should believe it because it's pure fact. That claim and that way of addressing the audience is increasingly mistrusted by people, in part because politicians have taught people to react that way. And if your claim to have no perspective, to have no view, just pure information is rejected, you can't address that situation by doubling down on the claim. So I think we're in a midst of a transition in the way trust is generated. And a newer emerging system it works a little bit differently. You have, instead of this claim of objectivity or voice of God or view from nowhere, you have, here's where we're coming from as an organization, as an individual journalist. Here's where I'm coming from. I do have some things that are important to me. I do have some starting points. I do have a background that you might want to know about. And added to that, very high standards of verification, meaning traditional journalism's bias towards evidence and proof and factuality, and openness to criticism, as Elmer said, and transparency in method. And if you put those things together, here's where I'm coming from: very high standards of verification, response to criticism, transparency in how we operate. Those things together, I think, are a better system than the old one that is becoming discredited. I want to add one other thing here is Dana's right that there were practices in the press that kind of led to this polarization and are feeding it. One of them is the commercial urge, the sort of sensationalism, where we don't pay attention to things unless they're attention getting. That's been a vice or a problem in the press for a long time. But it has a second part to it, which is I've spent a lot of time criticizing, which is the sophisticated journalists in the nation's capital, the people who work at the Washington Post and work at the Washington bureaus, have developed this style of savvy journalism where they're focused on the insiders and the way that the political game is played. And their goal is to explain to the outsiders how the pros sort of do it. And Germany has the same problem. I know because I asked people when I was there for 2018 about it. And this savvy style of insider journalism, where you have journalists reporting on politics as if it were just a game, kind of is the other side of the coin of sensationalism. And we need a press that can get beyond both of those things, because neither one of them addresses the cultural moment.
All right, this is important.
Can I ask
thought.
answer,
Just one little moment, because we have kind of questions and comments from our viewers coming in, and I'd like to take them into our conversation as well. So let's start with the first one from Robert Klemmer. He is asking quite an extensive question. Is there a market approach that could help steer interest towards better news? Who wants to take this question?
Yeah,
Dana.
actually, that's exactly what I was going to suggest, is that question. And I think, yes, and the market incentivizes certain things now, which we've talked about a little bit. It incentivizes a lack of responsibility on social media part for anything that they publish. And that incentivizes emotionality, which favors fake news. So how do you change that? We have a section in our law. It's known as Section 230. Yes. It says social media companies do not have to be responsible for the truth or anything. They don't have to be responsible for what they circulate. So if they circulate a fake news website that says something that is not true and actually maybe something that's totally harmful, it's fine. They can make money off of that. They don't have to be responsible. So the first thing we do is we look at that rule, we look at that law, and we probably change it. The next is that I really think we need to look at Europe. In Europe, there's much more acceptance for public funding for the media. And we need to do it because Americans are always skeptical of government in a way that can't be tampered in large part by the different political parties that come in and out of government. And then third, I think that we have to look at a place like Norway, where they have this wonderful media commission. And it's a way for the media to police itself. It's a commission that's made up of highly respected journalists and highly respected civil liberties activists in other aspects of life. It has no government, anybody on it. It has the ability to impose fines, but not criminal. It's not criminal. So it's a civil. It's more like a public opinion pressure, really,
Right.
but it's
so
done by.
There are quite some ideas and tools out there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Elmer already said this, and I think that that's there are ways to do it that don't involve the government, and that we should think about those.
Yeah.
Those are some.
And the
some of
second
the things
question from our viewers, maybe Jay can answer this. Is there really a crisis of trust in journalists, or is it just a perceived lack of trust? So what does media science say?
Well, it's real in that large portions of Donald Trump's base pre-reject the reporting from the national press, meaning before they've even considered it, they mistrust it. That's not a perception, that's how they interact with the news system. Now that would apply to a portion of the public, but it's a significant portion. So that's one sense in which it's not just perception. Another would be increasingly at the local level, editors, let's say, of local newspapers will tell you that their subscribers now get enraged when they find coverage that doesn't conform to their political opinions. And they take out their frustrations on the local press. Increasingly, people covering events, Elmer might have seen this himself in his tour, journalists are targets of hate and resentment when they are doing their jobs, covering important events in a way that was there before. It might happen once in a while, but now it's much more intense. So there's that. And then the other thing that I think is real evidence, not perception, but evidence, is that the right-wing media sphere is breaking off from the rest of the mainstream media and becoming a kind of information world of its own. And as much as people love to say, well, polarization is happening on both sides, that particular phenomena is unique to the right wing in the United States. And so, and that breaking off of the information sphere for the conservative movement is an expression of mistrust in the press.
Emma, during your road trip, all the travels, you share these impressions, and maybe you can answer another question here, whether it would help educating people on how journalists actually work, so that they get a more clear idea about our job and its standards and the rules and the tools and so on.
Yeah, I have to admit that I, of course, have encountered a hatred from time to time, where people treat us as fake news and they don't trust us. But most of the time, they are very open, very welcoming, and that is good news. I think that many people are still open to talk to the press. The thing is, we have to really, and that's the education part, we have to explain what we do with what we get there. For example, when we were in Greencastle just a couple of days ago in Indiana, interesting scene at City Hall. On one side, we had the Back the Blue, basically protesting to support the police, of course, and there were mostly Trump supporters. You know, they held up the Trump flags as well. And right around the corner on the other side of the City Hall, they were standing the Black Lives Matter protesters. And both sides were not talking to each other. They were just shouting, you know, their stuff on their side. They had perceptions of each other, which have nothing really to do with the facts and the truth. Both sides believe that the other side is not even willing to talk to the other side. And on both sides, they were asking us the question, what are you going to do with the interview? You know, we do the interview, and then they are really very distrustful of if we treat the interview in the way journalists should and would do. And I think that's a good point that we can follow up on, that we have to educate people more. It's a huge task. It costs money. It costs personnel. We tried that. I ran the news department in Germany for 13 years. And we really tried to reach out to the public. We had speeches. We have visitors coming to ZDF every day, and never they encountered a journalist, because they were led by somebody who led them on the area and told them something about ZDF, but that was it. So we installed a system where people who would come there would meet journalists, ask their questions, very critical questions. We would have to, you know, own up to our mistakes and so on. And that is a good process. Both sides learn a lot. And I think that's a really good point that the question is making here. We need to educate the people, but at the same time ourselves. I think that's very important.
There's another
and Katja, if I may, I really have to apologize.
I know,
I
you have to run to comment.
I have to actually, I have to stand up for a live shot. And thank you so much, and all the best to everyone involved.
Thank you so much, and good luck with the travels. Bye, Emma.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. So Jay and Dana, another interesting thought and question from our viewers. The effectiveness of the fourth estate is kind of threatened by the disappearance of local media, especially newspapers. So how do you view it, and what do you do about it, especially on the local and regional level, where the encounter, you know, with information and journalists and our work is kind of from day to day, on a daily basis?
So I'm on the board of a small community newspaper in Virginia, in a rural community called Fauquier County, and we struggle every month to stay alive. And we're the only print and online media anymore. And this year I did a story that I don't usually write for them because I'm on the board, but this year I did a story about what it is like in a newspaper with 1.5 reporters to put out the newspaper every day, because we're online every day. And it was fascinating because people really just have they just really don't know how we do our jobs. And especially when you're small and you're not on television, you're just racing from meeting to meeting and from, phone call to phone call. And the reporters work 100 hours a week. And they do everything there is to do. So I do think that because the national chains are so dominant, and so, again, I hate to keep coming back to social media, but so many people get their social media in the bubble that they exist in on social media, because apparently we all have our own bubbles. That cuts out or dominates economically local news. And so a lot of people aren't turning to local news, or they're not willing to buy the newspaper anymore. And that has also created a market-driven crisis in local news. So people say they want it, but they don't necessarily want to pay for it. And more, I think they aren't convinced they need it because they're getting a lot of news for free, or a lot of things they think are news for free. And it's really being on the backside of all this. I'll say it's just so much work to keep this little paper alive from month to month. We exist on advertising revenue like everybody else, and subscriptions. And so you throw in COVID, and it has really killed off dozens of newspapers. COVID was just like the last straw for many of them to stay alive. So I do think, I don't know what the new model would be for that, but I do think there has to be one, because financially they just cannot stay alive in the same form. And there's a lot of experimentation going on right now, like online only type community newspapers, because brick and mortar is just so expensive. So unfortunately, it's another problem.
Can I add to
What's
that?
your idea?
America is just really waking up to the crisis in local news. People who studied it reported a shocking finding, which is that most Americans think newspapers are doing great financially and are actually rich institutions. They don't really know that there is this crisis. And they, as Dana said, they sort of started taking the local newspaper for granted in a lot of ways. And it's particularly important because local news is where people first form a relationship with journalism and learn why you need journalists in the first place. And when that relationship doesn't happen at the local level, they are in a sense abandoned to social media, which I think is part of what Dana is saying. And they become much more creatures of the ideological media, which are just waiting to engage them and sell their own biases back to them. So right now, the crisis in local journalism is an unsolved problem in the United States. A lot of people have trouble with an unsolved problem because they just ask, so what's the solution? Well, actually, there is at the moment no good solution, but we're starting to wake the country up. And so, for example, local foundations are realizing now that they can't just put their public relations press releases into the local newspaper. There may not be a local newspaper anymore, and that this is an institution that foundations may have to support. And so some newspapers are becoming nonprofits. They're becoming more like community institutions, more like a museum or a library or a zoo than a commercial business. And we're still in the midst of waking up to this problem. And I don't think we have a solution. And there is no easy solution yet because Americans don't trust government funding and commercial engines for news are all drifting towards the platforms.
The United States is sure not the only country when it comes to, news deserts on a local level. The problem is all over. And
it's a global problem, yeah.
I mean, it's already a sign, kind of at least a little sign of hope that people, start and get to realize the problem. And only if you analyze this, you can maybe move on to find solution, whether it be public funding or transparent funding from local foundations or whatever it might be. back to social media and how this changes the conversation, not only in the United States. A question to Dana from one of our YouTube viewers. You said, Dana, social media is a threat to the freedom of the press. What should be done is asked. So it's a very big question.
Yeah.
Sure, regulating Twitter and Facebook and so on. Wouldn't this be against the core of press freedom and free information? So how to solve this contradiction?
Yep, I think that that's what we thought of in the beginning when social media appeared, and they appeared just at the perfect time for stealing all the content from the regular reporters, because social media really came to flourish during the late to mid 2000s when we were having a news crisis. The economic crisis had really cut into advertising revenue, and at the Washington Post and elsewhere, staff was cut. Social media came along, Facebook came along, and we, the press, our owners said to Facebook, can you please take our work for free and just circulate it on your platform, because so many people were getting, especially the new generation. So we, not knowing what to do, we helped create this problem. So social media now not only takes what I am paid by the Washington Post to write and puts it on its platform for free, but then it sells advertising against what I produce, and it takes the advertising rather than letting the Washington Post take it. So it gets this freebie all around, and it is not responsible for anything I write or anyone else writes. So that really needs to be looked at. And in Europe, your GDPR is the closest model that the world has to a rational way to regulate social media. And the United States is so far behind in that. And I just think that, a lot of people are starting to catch on to this when we had Facebook become such an influencer during the 2016 election. And maybe that will continue, but it's going to take a lot of work to change the model, to change the totally free hand that social media has now, which I'll add one more component of that, is that anybody who wants to create a false news site and call it a news site can make that news site appear much more popular than it actually is by using bots. And in Europe, especially during election time, Germany in particular was very harsh on Twitter and Facebook and not closing down the bots. And they still have large fines that they're willing to impose on both of those companies if they do not do a better job policing bots, because bots are fake. They're not people. And yet almost some people think that almost 50% of the entities that circulate social media are actually these automated bots. So that is another problem that we need to be able to solve. And I really think the United States needs to look at the European model much more carefully.
Just two thoughts from the European or the German side, if I may. We certainly also have to recognize that for many people in many other countries of the world, especially living and working as journalists in authoritarian regimes, the internet and social media is a very important platform of getting information out and of receiving information. Second thought, Germany as the first country ever, if I recall it correctly, passed a platform kind of engagement and controlling law. So we try to kind of reglement hate speech and fake news, but especially hate speech, with help of a law. Let's see how this will work, but the ideas are certainly out there. Let me add one more question from our listeners and viewers, going back to Trump. The question is, in what ways are journalists who report about the lies of the president are pressured? Jay, do you have any experience from your colleagues?
I'm not sure what is meant by pressured, but when
just the pressured, apparently threatened, or not receiving information anymore, being excluded from the press briefing room, being thrown out of the White House, or whatever it may be.
Dana may know more about this, but one of the strange things about the Trump press operation is they don't seem to take revenge that way. They're much more interested in kind of addressing the press as a hate object. That's the way I put it. And so when there are conflicts between journalists and the president, that's not considered a negative thing. Trump actually wants to be seen as being kind of like harassed by journalists. And so they're much more interested, from my point of view, in setting up these scenes of conflict between themselves and journalists than in taking revenge on them. However, Trump's movement, the movement of people around the country who are Trump supporters, are eager to project hate at journalists and harass them online, tell them how angry they are with them, just try to discredit their reporting, make fun of them. So his army is engaged in kind of disqualifying journalists all the time.
And it's not only a show or game, so to say. We recall
it's harassment. Yeah,
we recall Jim Acosta from CNN. I mean, that's apparently also our viewer. What is he referring to? So did this change, Dana, under Trump's presidency, if you compare it with other administrations? I mean, you said right at the beginning that presidents normally hate journalists, which is a compliment for journalists doing their job. But,
well, it did, but in a counterintuitive way. On the one hand, you have Jim Acosta, who was barred temporarily from the White House press briefing room until he sued, and then a whole process ensued, and they let him back. But everyone who covers the White House has to be able to have some kind of relationship on background with people in the White House in order to know what's going on beyond the podium, which is really where we learn about things. It's not from those press briefings. So every administration, no matter what they say about the press, they know that it's a two-way street, and behind the cameras, or when the cameras aren't on, you have to have relationships with people inside. So that has gone on, but what has really happened in this administration, and you saw it from day one, and it was so striking, was that there were so many people inside the White House willing to leak hugely sensitive and embarrassing information about the person they were working for. So I remember almost right away, there was a leak of a conversation, a verbatim conversation with the president of Mexico between Trump and the president of Mexico, and then Trump and the Australian president or prime minister. And those sorts of things are highly classified. So to see it in the newspaper, it was obviously leaked by someone who did not like his Mexico policy, where he was, portraying himself as the tough guy. And then actually he had a pretty decent conversation with the Mexican president that totally was different than the persona he wanted to portray. So you've had unprecedented leaking from inside the White House from very senior people about very sensitive things that you've never, ever seen before in in any administration, you know, I've been around for 4 of them, 4 or 5 before. So
totally
it's a dual
different
thing.
than the persona
I mean,
who
it's a contradictory trend that you've seen.
Yeah. Could I add one thing on that, which I think is really
Absolutely.
important? I think we are in the midst of what the writer Masha Gessen, who spent time in Russia and the United States, calls in her new book an autocratic attempt. An autocratic attempt. That's the stage of an autocratic takeover when the process is still reversible, but it is underway. And I thought last night's debate was an example of that. It was the behavior of a would-be autocrat expressing his contempt for the entire system, for the press, for his opponent, for the concept of a debate, etc. And since the very beginning, as Dana pointed out, there have been people inside the government who kind of detected an autocratic attempt or instinct on Trump's part and have tried to do something about it, especially by leaking. And she's absolutely right. The amount of leaking, the sensitivity of the information coming from the White House, the willingness of people to tell reporters the terrible things that are going on, the agonizing that insiders have done as they've watched this autocratic attempt proceed has been one of the most striking features of the Trump government. And the reason she calls it an attempt is that it's still at the point where it can be reversed. But that doesn't necessarily last forever. And that's the seriousness of the stakes here in American democracy.
So as a closure, the closing question, I don't know whether you can give us any sort of say hope or optimistic outlook when it comes to that autocratic attempt, Dana. Just one thought.
Oh, yes.
To do about
Absolutely.
it. How to
Well,
go
absolutely,
against
because we both teach this new generation of journalists, and that is what gives me hope, because they have technical tools and technical abilities that I didn't ever grow up with. And if you can marry that with becoming good source builders and journalists with good ethics, which I do think is possible because we're doing it at the University of Maryland, you're going to get some pretty fearless people who have tricks that we didn't have. Not tricks in a bad way, but have technical skills that we didn't have. You see the emergence of data journalism. Only if that's paired with good human-to-human contact can that really be forceful. So that plus, you know, our states, one of the silver linings to me in all this is both the increased power of states and state government to, you know, work their own way through problems, like you've seen in California with the fires, or in New York with coronavirus. You know, they got absolutely no help from the president. But you've also seen it on the world stage, where Europe in particular, who looked for so many years to the United States for leadership for obvious reasons, you know, I think Europe's just taking it on their own and building their own coalition with or without the United States to go forward on really important things like climate change and social media regulation. And so I think he's not going to be able to do anything serious unless, well, I guess if he gets reelected, then maybe. But you know, if it's a disputed election, I think we'll have some problems. But I do think that justice will prevail and that people in the United States won't put up with it, including perhaps some members of the Republican Party who have been silent through all of this.
So people won't put up with this, Jay, is that correct? So
I'm not sure.
Prediction.
I'm
Jay's
very
a pessimist, he said in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm very worried that this autocratic attempt, which I do think is underway, I think that's a good description of what is happening in the United States, could succeed. And that is a very disturbing prospect. However, I do agree that there are some signs in journalism of hope. I think Dana's right. The next generation of journalists doesn't think like the prior generations, and we have reason to think that they might show us how to kind of reinvent this craft. I think there's more seriousness now around diversifying the newsroom than there used to be because of the wave of changes and protests in the United States. We've kind of like reached a critical mass there. And this is maybe this is sort of like a ironic point of hope, but I used to think, and I think a lot of people were in this frame of mind, that maybe if Trump lost, that we could kind of like get rid of him and kind of go back to restore the system the way it was, go back to what was normal. And now I think no one really believes that anymore. It's not going to be that simple. And so I think there is a dawning perception that a lot of bad habits and traps that the press has been in for a long time just don't apply anymore and can't be afforded anymore. An example would be the emptiness of false equivalence, some of the excesses of the savvy insider style that I talked about before. They're still there. Those things are still there. But I think the prestige of those forms is evaporating. More and more journalists see how inadequate they are. I think there's more pressure on political journalists from their colleagues in other fields to kind of like update their practices. So I'm a little bit hopeful there that there could be some breakthroughs. But the United States has lost its position as a worldwide leader of press freedom and beacon to the rest of the world. And I don't think that is coming back no matter who wins.
But in all the pessimism, or should I call it realism, Jay, there is, this glimmer of hope that people who pursue this profession, and I still think it's a wonderful profession and an important one, that they are willing to learn and willing to change their behavior, because everybody understands what's at stake here.
Yes.
Not only in the United States, but in many, many other countries of the world too. We from Reporters Without Borders, we try it with our little means, and as a closure, I just wanted to draw your attention to the campaign we just launched also in the United States. It's called the Press Freedom Pact. It's a campaign where we challenge the two candidates running for office to publicly commit to upholding the principles of press freedom, First Amendment, and so on. So if you're interested, the hashtag Press Freedom Pact. And for those who are in Germany and happen to be in Berlin next Wednesday, October 7th, we will gather in front of the American Embassy at Brandenburg Gate for an action to underwrite, so to say, our Press Freedom Pact. So if you happen to be in Berlin and spare 30 minutes, not you guys, you are, you keep the flag up in the United States, but for those in Berlin who happen to be around and want to support the issue of press freedom, which is so important for all of us, then we are thankful and grateful. And we are thankful and grateful to Dana Priest, to Jay Rosen, and to our absentee already, Elmar Tevesen, who comments right now, I guess, the debate for German television viewers for this very intensive and concentrated conversation about press freedom in your country. We all keep our fingers crossed for democratic elections and a democratic result. So thank you very much. And now we close our Zoom meeting. Thanks for all the people, to all the people who helped us in the background, Juliane and Christine. And thank you so much also to our viewers and listeners. And see you around next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye,
having us.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.